will be wonderful. Wonderful.
Dr.
And
Foster,
welcome,
you can lead
welcome
the way.
Hector as well. Hector just joined us. Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, where are you at, Hector?
I am in New York City, currently at the headquarters of JPMC.
Nice. Well, welcome everybody. I'll just go ahead and start. I also want to thank everybody for coming, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts today because it's a topic that's kind of an interesting and highly relevant one. So I've actually made a PowerPoint. I'm sure you read the Seed article. It was pretty short. Let me get this PowerPoint in presentation mode here. Basically, the story was that, sorry, let me just leave it there and talk for a second. In 2010, doctors, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name right, Doctors Reifler and Nyan published an article allegedly documenting a backfire effect. And we already knew, I'll just go ahead and go to the next slide here and just talk while you can look at it. We already knew that people don't change their minds easily. You know, if you're, none of you students are as old as me, I don't think, but there used to be an old show called All in the Family, starring a fellow named Archie Bunker, who was just like, he sat in a chair, not unlike the one I'm sitting in now, one of these easy chairs. And he was even more sunk into his dogmatic views than he was into the chair. And so I think we all have a little bit of Archie Bunker in us, right? We already knew about confirmation bias. You know, that's a very famous bias. And as it should be. I mean, confirmation bias is sort of the granddaddy of biases, and it's also popular among granddaddies. But the good question is how to overcome it, right? Can we actually, like, okay, let's suppose you have two granddaddies and they have opposite political views, right? Or religious views or whatever. And they're both very firm in their beliefs, right? Then if those views contradict each other, they're not both right, surely. But if both of these granddaddies are smart people, presumably we'd like to think that they could, you know, adjust their views to what's true. But notoriously, people are very resistant to that. And that resistance in the scholarly field reached a sort of nadir in 2010 when Nyan and Reifler published this study that showed not only did people resist changing their views, and not only did they not actually ever change their views, it's actually worse than that. Presenting them with evidence to the contrary actually solidified their views, right? So in other words, if I believe that something is true and it's of a category of a, you know, deep nature, emotional or political or whatever, and then you present a correction to me, I'm actually more strongly wedded to my incorrect views than I was before you presented the correction. That's what their study showed. And this was just like, oh, well, it's like the death of teaching critical thinking. Like if facts will never sway people, but have the opposite effect, then it's almost like you'd better not try to give arguments. It's almost like you'd better not show them the research, or you're just gonna make it worse, right? And so this is highly discouraging for those of us who like to teach critical thinking as our jobs, right? And so thankfully, it turns out the results were not so bleak. More studies have come along, and there's been more than one, but one in particular, that have shown that actually this isn't true. People do change their views. Less than we would like, but they were not able to reproduce the backfire effect. And there's a lot of side questions that you might be wondering about, or that I wonder about, which is what went wrong with the original study. But the fact is, more recent studies have not verified the backfire effect, or at least they found it to be exceedingly rare. So let's take a look at some of the things related to this. So Nyan and Reifler allegedly found a backfire effect. However, this is the slide I should have had up when I was just talking. Here we go. But I want to point out that this question is a huge one, right? To whatever degree people resist changing their beliefs, it's super important. As Zarlis pointed out, the existence of the backfire effect isn't just a research opportunity for political scientists. It's a question that goes to the very heart of how public debate is conducted. So let's put it this way. Nyan and Reifler, even if they were, even if they exaggerated what the reality somehow, even so, they raised a huge question, which is, do people change their beliefs? If and how, to what degree, and then what methods are best at helping them to change their beliefs? So again, we in the critical thinking field like to think that it's possible. That's why we do this, is so that people will use logic and reasoning and research to arrive at true beliefs instead of false ones. And that requires the ability and willingness to change our beliefs. So is it possible, and under what circumstances? All right, so we go to the next slide. So the research, there's been, I'm going to cite several authors here, but there's this novella research, 2018. To be clear, people generally still engage in motivated reasoning when emotions are at stake. I think you all know this from the Thanksgiving dinner table. There is clear evidence that people filter the information they seek, notice, accept, and remember. Ideology also predicts how much people will respond to factual correction. Okay, so I think a pretty current example, of course, would be like coronavirus, right? How are vaccines effective? Right? Are they safe? Are they effective? Should you take them, or is it, and you would think a question like that isn't political in its nature. It relates to politics, but it's a fact-based question. It's like, how many people get the coronavirus or get hospitalized or die if they've had such and such a vaccination? You would think that question would be independent of your ideology because it's a factual claim. But yet we see in our society that we can have a pretty good prediction of what you're going to believe about that based upon what your political views are. So facts and ideology are really wed really strongly. What we've seen over the past 2 years has been consistently across the board, regardless of partisanship. When people get told a falsehood and then get told that that is a falsehood and get presented with a correction, their belief in the falsehood goes down, regardless of whether they have supported it or are against it. Partisans stick to their beliefs more, but we found that we are fact resistant, but not fact immune. If I can do just one thing, I want to dispel this vision that all is lost and that facts are for nothing. We do want to find the truth. Okay, so let's take a look at some more slides here. Here's a Porter and Wood study as summarized by Zarlis. Porter and Wood have some examples of political related claims, but are factual claims, but they relate to ideology and made by famous politicians. And then they present a correction, and then they track whether people change their views. And notice that on the left, they have liberal, and then there's moderate, and then conservative on the right. And you'll see that so basically you'll see the top lighter shaded bar represents people's belief in that statement before they experience the correction. They experience the correction, and then you'll see in all cases, the darker shaded bar represents their belief in that statement after they receive the correction. And the darker shaded bar in all cases is lower. It's still affected by your political views, but it is altered. So facts had an impact. Okay, let's move on to the next one. One of the most extreme cases of people changing, of our society changing its view, maybe the most extreme that I've seen. Well, it's, as far as I'm aware, it is the most, is gay marriage, right? You'll see in 2003, not all that long ago, there were only 33% of people favored gay marriage among all adults. And then as of 2013, only 10 years after that, the majority supported it. I imagine it's much even higher than that now. This is just support. There we go. And there's a bullet point on the side from a study by someone named Avery. Support as of last October was 70%. So that's a pretty stark upward shift in people's support for a political position. It's not quite that way, I don't think, when it comes to a lot of other political claims. Notice how the curve on the right shows it's very sort of generation dependent, but we see all generations shifting to a certain degree. So let's go to the next one. But why? What makes this topic different than others? And people gave different reasons for why they changed their views. The leading one is knowing someone who is gay. Another person is another one is people getting more open as they get older. Some people say it's just more prevalent. It's inevitable. The world is different now. Everyone is free to choose love, happiness. The government should stay out. So ideological thing, and then belief in equal rights, which I think would be proponents of gay marriage, their sort of lead argument is only 8%. And then moral religious beliefs is at 5%. So it turns out that personal connection was the strongest one. There's a really interesting another tangent I could go on about a bogus study to this effect. It was really fascinating. I heard all about it on NPR, a study that showed that people changed their views based on knowing someone in the affected category. And then it turned out that study itself was totally bogus. So it's kind of wild, the research that's gone on in this field. So if you're a student who's interested in like political science, and particularly if you want to do empirical research on it, this is a really, let's say, vibrant, rapidly changing field right here. It'd be an interesting one to study. Okay, we see in our society very different, and I don't want to. I put up these slides not just because these are examples where people hold different views. These aren't just. I hope you know now. Like the two examples I have here, these aren't just examples of people having very different views. People have very different views about religion, right? About whether there's a God or not. But you don't usually see, well, actually, there have been wars over religion. I sit corrected. But these examples here aren't just views where it's like, it's curious that why you think that, Uncle Joe. These are views that are actually kind of tearing apart society in a way. I mean, think about it. If you believe that climate change is not only human caused, but is sort of escalating and potentially going to run out of control, that is a doom and gloom scenario, right? We are in for sort of the end of the world as we know it. That's a huge thing. We got to do something. We got to do it now, and extreme action seems to be justified if it's necessary. It seems that way, right? Same with the bottom, right? If you believe that this last election was stolen, the last presidential election was stolen, and that Donald Trump is the rightful current president, I don't know that it justifies a lot of the things those people did that day, but it would justify some high degree of intervention, right? We can't just allow elections to be stolen in a democracy. We got to do something urgent. So I'm just saying these aren't just curious divisions. These are urgent ones, right? People on each side are going to be very, very motivated to do extreme things. So what works? We read a whole bunch of articles about this, and I did not find a unanimous answer. I found a lot of answers, which in a way is perfect because it's time to turn it over to the students and faculty who are here to engage in a conversation about this. So let's talk about it. Some say, so a couple articles I found said logic alone doesn't work, right? Some say logic and emotion, logos and pathos, that seems to work. Some say that emotion works for some people and logic works for other people. Some say that it's not really logic or emotion, but it's sort of an intuition or group membership that, in fact, Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of interesting research in the field of sort of empirical political science and psychology. Political psychology, I think it's called. Some have said it's a personal connection or that it's simply generational, like the Pew study I was showing a little bit ago. And some say, heck, we're in a post-truth era, right? Nothing seems to work. There's no such thing as agreed upon facts anymore. And there's actually been more than 50 articles recently about that in important publications like The Atlantic. So I'm going to turn it over to you, faculty and students. And I want you to share, first of all, like, what are your experiences in this area? Is it your experience that people do change their views about deeply embedded things? And then if so, what does the trick? Like, what's the best way to go about sharing ideas that's going to have the highest likelihood of helping people change for the better? That's my question.
Hey, Chris, I'll tell you this much, I joined this late, so my apologies. I was in a meeting with Michael Hayden.
Just
But
glad to see you, Bill.
Good. And you guys always do some great stuff. Listen, I'm just going to tell you this much. This is just from my old career. When I would go into a facility, and I looked at organizational culture and I looked at people, you would see, you're walking, you see the artifacts, then you see the espoused values, then you see the perceptions eventually, because you've been in there for a long time, right? They start to trust you and talk to you. But the espoused values sometimes are what the organization thinks they are. And then where the reality is where they're here, where they're really at, that you start to close that gap. But what I was relating to, what I find interesting here, just looking at this, and again, not listening to what you said, but I do know some of this. I do know that people do change, people have different views based on, cultures, based on work cultures, based on leadership views and different things. So, sometimes what I always try to do, and I was always taught not to be insensitive, but keep your objectivity, keep. And what I like, Chris, and I got it pinned up right here. This is a true story. This is from your critical thinking workshop. I remember I put a comment in the chat. You came back and I said, I was talking about Dr. Stephen Brookfield about, examine your assumptions with a healthy dose of skepticism, when it could be true, could be false. But you typed in the box the ILO, our definition of critical thinking. And logical reasoning to interpret relevant information, explore diverse perspectives, and engage in metacognition. Well, I love that. So I taped it and I put it up there. And so what I'm just trying to say with people is, to understand this, you've got to be self-aware. You've got to be balanced in your thinking. You've got to see your logic and see, is this, premise, conclusion, is this sound? Because you've got to kind of know what you want to follow. And you got to be aware to look at those dynamics a little bit. So I don't know if that helps you a little bit, but maybe it's a little fodder here to get some conversation going.
I like it.
Yeah, what I would say, at least from a healthcare perspective, is that a lot of the embeddedness that we're seeing, as far as the vaccine example that you provided, is extremely appropriate. And it's carried itself over to essentially everything that's related to science, specifically science related to health. And what we are finding in public health specifically is that the social media is allowing individuals to embed themselves into a situation where they really cannot escape, even if they're somewhat open to critical thought, because it would impact not only themselves and their belief system, but it would also impact their social network. And that's creating some really significant issues as far as vaccination rates, even from people who are maybe marginally interested in, understanding what's actually happening. So there are, I think, as Bill mentioned, you have to be somewhat open-minded. You have to be able to be critical with yourself. But what we're seeing, at least in terms of healthcare, is that people are less willing to be in that position and more sort of encamped in one belief system, regardless of whatever evidence is provided, because it's the belief that whatever you're providing is not factual. It's there to try and sway them or steer them into a false space.
Right. Yeah, there's a fallacy called poisoning the well, right? Where if you have some method of rejecting all things that disagree with you, right, then there's nothing that can get in.
That's the my truth statement. Well, this is my truth. This is what I believe. This is, how I perceive, how I understand what all the information that's presented in front of me. I'll give you a very quick example. I'm a believer. I'm a Christian. I teach scripture, and I have quite a few members of my family who are gay, and they don't understand that I want to be around them, that I want to listen to them, I want to love them, I want to experience them.
Mhm.
I believe, or I am something that is completely against. How can you want to be? I'm like, because I love you. Your blood, and this relationship, this interaction, this event between me and you transcends what I believe to be true and what you believe to be
Mhm.
true. And I think that's where a lot, especially when it comes to people who are believers, they tend to lean on the text and not understand the human connection and relationship that's right in front of their face. And so
Mhm.
it just leads more into, again, I really think that whole my truth statement, it's been very detrimental to the culture, I think, to the American culture. This is what I believe. I see the facts in front of me, but this is what I believe. It could be a lie, but that's what they believe.
Mm.
Hector, you just triggered something bubble up surface of my brain. I got to share. Dr. Rosabeth Moss Kanter, she's a Harvard professor, and I've read a lot of her books and different things on change and so forth. But I remember she had a workshop that I watched. It was Enduring Principles for Changing Times. And this is maybe about 10, 12 years ago. But basically, to sum it all up, she said this, as you move forward, have a higher sense of purpose. Always be open to experience, keep an open mind. And then number 3, find common ground. See, and unless you're open to consider and not judge, other views and people, and you embrace all that openness to experience, and you understand that I'm going to find common ground with all of these people, and I'm going to relate, people pick up on that. And, and it just accelerates the process to come together. I'm just going to give a quick example. Charles helped me last year because I was going to see some of my buddies and during the COVID time. And I called him, we got kind of like 2 different backgrounds, not a big gap. But I said, Charles, can you help me? This just bubbled up, but can you help me understand maybe what I'm facing here if I should go to this event, because we're not fully out of COVID? And boy, he gave me some perspectives, from his wife, and, being a doctor, from him looking at it and everything else. And I walked away from there much more informed, much more understanding, and more self-aware of all of those dynamics. So Hector, that was powerful what you just said. So thank you.
Yeah, I had something to share about that. Oops, sorry if I started some trying to find the thing to share. I'll put it in the chat. This is on SoundCloud. I don't know if that's free, but you can find it elsewhere. There is this great, I love this podcast, Snap Judgment. And well, it's an NPR show on Saturdays. An amazing episode of Snap Judgment was about people changing their beliefs. And in particular, it was 2 members of the KKK who changed their views, like 360 is a full circle, 180, right? They did a total change, where obviously they were in the KKK, and there was a leader, there was like a local leader of it, and then above him was the Grand Dragon. Basically what happened, to sort of make it short, was that the lower level leader met this piano player who was a Black pianist. And he said, I've never heard you said something like, I've never heard a guy play that well since Jerry Lee Lewis or whatever. And then the guy says, where do you think he learned it from Black people? Basically, we were already doing this. The guy's like, no. The long story short, they make friends, or at least they meet up a bunch of times, and the guy ends up converting and leaving the clan. But they said, don't talk to that Grand Dragon. You're not safe if you meet with him. Well, the pianist goes and meets with the Grand Dragon, and over a course of time, that Grand Dragon turns in his robes and gives up and totally changes his view. So it's a really powerful example if you want to listen to that podcast. I gave you the spoiler, but it is possible for people to change even deeply held views, in the right context. And the thing that related to what Bill was saying was like a human who was just willing to be their friend and sort of stick it out, and be an example of the thing that they allegedly hated, but they realized they couldn't keep hating. Mhm.
One thing that we often overlook too is the kind of the, well, in healthcare, it's called the health belief model and social cognitive theory. They both work off the same concept that you're going to kind of model the behavior that's around you, and you're going to follow what you believe to be true, similar to what Hector mentioned, my truth.
Yeah.
So what we've found is that I'll use a personal example. My uncle in Tennessee, he passed away from COVID infection in July, and his family was very, very deeply rooted in the belief that COVID is fake. The virus was fake. He died of something else, and that it was just being put up as a statistic. His family almost split right down the middle after his passing. His wife got a vaccine. His youngest daughter and her spouse became vaccinated. However, his oldest daughter and her spouse and children did not become vaccinated and still travel regularly despite multiple active COVID infections. So the impact that it can have on, like you were saying with My Truth and firsthand experiences, that's what we're seeing in healthcare, is that basically you have to have someone, if you're in that encampment, like with your example, Dr. Foster, on the gentleman making a friend, if you have a firsthand example of someone dying and you believe what they've actually gone through, or you've seen it firsthand, you're more likely to make a change towards whatever it is that direction is. So for the individual that was in the KKK, seeing that, an African American could be successful and be a very accomplished pianist, and that his, favorite pianist, Jerry Lee Lewis growing up, was inspired by African Americans, allowed him to at least open that door slightly. And that's sort of what's happening now with healthcare, which is in my field, where unfortunately we have a tremendous amount of individuals that are dying. And we're seeing about 3/4 of the cases where once an individual has died or been hospitalized themselves, then they start to believe it's real and will, pursue some type of vaccination, or at least looking a little bit more into a balanced literature on it.
It's so when your convictions are shaken, when you stand so firm on a belief and something comes along and shakes the conviction, all of a sudden, it's like a house of cards. It comes tumbling down sometimes. In my very limited experience, I found people who've fallen specifically deeply into any kind of religion. It takes some time to kind of shed some light on some of their beliefs that are not only antiquated but just wrong on a human level. And here at the bank, COVID changed everything as far as we do business. The firm made $18 million more for everybody working from home than being in the office. And a lot of my staff didn't think that things would ever, go back to once we're out of COVID, everything will go back to the way that it was. And very quickly, they learned, their conviction was shaken, and they realized that they have to find a place in this new world that we're living in. And it all comes down, I think the root of it is conviction. When your convictions get questioned, how do you respond to that?
That is great. And I was thinking about it in relation to some of the next questions I was on the list here, which is like, well, if you think about two people with conflicting views, and let's just suppose the views matter, right? Like, it's not just, they're picking at scabs to bring these things up, because that can happen too, where you pick fights just for fun. But if these matter, if it's like, should I get vaccinated type of thing, that matters, right? It could be a life threatening situation. Presumably these people, let's just assume they're equally smart and approximately the same age, whatever. If you say, well, they should change their beliefs, by symmetry, it seems like we should be willing to change our own beliefs, right? We can't just say, when will those people change, or else we might be the people who are dogmatic, right? So it seems that by symmetry, both parties, to be rational, should be willing to change their views. How do we know when that's the case? We tend to live in these, I'm going to just scroll ahead briefly. I have more things to talk about here, but if we get to it, I have this thing is sort of web of belief, and I've got the red and blue here, where this isn't original to me. This is, Willard Van Orman Quine, a philosopher, came up with similar ideas, and a whole bunch of other people, that our beliefs are interconnected, that I believe in something, and that's a strand of my web, but it's connected to a bunch of other strands, and they support each other. So I can't just remove a strand without affecting the others. I can't just swap it out. If you took a strand from the blue web here, and let's suppose it means like politically blue, and they say gay marriage is good, right? And you try to stick it in the red web, it doesn't fit, right? In the red web, the statement that gay marriage is good doesn't align with all these other things that are in the red web. So it conflicts. They will say, if the blue belief gay marriage is good moved into the red web sounds like it's an attack on the family or on God or something like that. Vice versa. Take the statement that gay marriage is bad and put it in the blue web, and it doesn't fit there either. It conflicts with everything else. So the blue person thinks, oh, this is a belief that's homophobic, right? They hate gay people. And so both beliefs taken out of their context creates what we call a straw man fallacy, right? A tendency for that. We can't even understand them unless we understand them in their proper context, right? So it's very difficult to understand contrasting beliefs. Yeah, go ahead.
This speaks well, I think, Chris. First of all, the educational concept that children, for instance, when being educated, aren't blank slates. They have an existing structures that around which new knowledge is framed. So even for working with fairly young children, they already have existing belief structures that govern how new information gets assimilated. And of course, this gets even more challenging when we get into adulthood. But it got me thinking about climate change. I think that's a great example. For someone to say, I don't believe in climate change, one can, of course, try to present various facts about climate. It's most of my experience, it's kind of like, kind of hitting a brick wall. There's not really any receptivity just because I provided more graphs or more data. It really doesn't have any impact. And I think a lot of it goes back to this. There are some, in my experience, for instance, who have religious opposition to climate change because they feel that only an all-powerful God can radically alter the climate. Humans simply can't do that, therefore we're not. Or there's political reasons, that it's part of a political structure where refuting climate change is just what one does. And there are many others as well. So I think it makes it challenging as a scientist communicating things, because you almost have to be a polymath to communicate things. And you almost have to spend a lot of time with the individual and tease out what is the web, what are the webs of ideas and beliefs that are all connecting everything, in order to begin to understand how to make the right snips to clear away these other, or at least to set them aside enough for that person to be receptive to what you're trying to say about climate. And it is interesting that a lot of research shows that the more strongly one argues that climate change is really happening, the more firmly most people tend to believe it's not.
Yeah.
And then scientists are left scratching their heads, because it isn't a matter of science, it's a matter of psychology, a matter of education, and all these other factors come into play. So it does make it very difficult as educators to.
And the web, thank you, Clifford. That's an excellent point. I agree with Bill. Really insightful. And then I was thinking about also, when you think about the web metaphor, if you remove a web, that would harm the web, right? We resist that. You can't just replace a strand and everything goes back to normal. It's a painful experience, right? It's difficult, because then what's true? What's true anymore? You take away one strand, especially a strand that's close to the center. Yeah. So what does Quine say? Well, he says, like, where does the web faces reality as a whole. It meets it as a whole. It's like a holistic epistemology, right? But where does it touch reality? It touches it on these little strands here, right? That's where webs connect to your room, where they touch. And so we have to look at those sort of data points. And that's where science would say, well, let's make some predictions, right? If climate change is real, we should expect X to be true. If it's not real, we would expect Y to be true, right? At least that's what we would teach in critical thinking.
And you know, Chris, and another thing that just bubbled up to the surface of my brain, hearing Clifford talk and you talk, this is a great theory. And it does explain, predict, and give us some foundation for understanding. And I can't say enough for an opportunity I had back in like 05 or 06. We did this business leadership challenge at St. Ambrose University. We took high school kids and they made a project and so forth. And they brought business leaders in and different people in to show them how to do a business plan. Well, because these were high schoolers, all of these leaders were sharing all their different philosophies, you know, and as an older person sitting in there, I went, my goodness gracious, it would have taken me months to get to know this individual this way, you know, because they probably wouldn't have shared it with me if they weren't in that setting. And so what I like that you're bringing to the surface for all of us is an increased awareness of all these dynamics that are involved in getting to know people, and that you have to be a little patient too to get them for that to kind of naturally come out, right? Because you can't rush this, I would think. And as long as you're showing mutual respect, you can consider it and be open to it and go along and learn. But if you rush to judgment and you just race in, you say, well, that, you know, and you stereotype or you got a bias or whatever, if you're not aware of, you know, your own thinking and your own openness to experience, you might not be able to really see this clear, you know, and you might not be able to go, you know, I'll just use Charles because he's at the top of my screen. But if we got together and Charles said, I'm a diehard Detroit Tigers fan or something, I said, well, I like the Bears better or something, you know, you go, hey, I like Charles, this is good, this is good, this is good, but I don't like Detroit baseball, or I don't like this. I mean, whatever that is. But the point is, you got to kind of let that valuable rapport emerge. And then you've got to get to know people and understand their needs, wants, values, you know, habits and so forth. But that's what I love about what you're doing here, is you're allowing me to see this more. And so I sure appreciate this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. Those are kind words and insightful points as well. And that's certainly true. I've read a bunch of things about, that's a consistent theme, you know, about if you want to influence people is be there for them to talk to and know they can trust you as a friend, and not just be there as a person to argue with, right? They want people, if they're going to change or if they're going to leave a cult or whatever, they need somebody who loves them independent of that, right? Or loves them or cares about them, who's a human to them, independent of whether they agree or disagree with you. And that's a beautiful point. So a point you made earlier, I actually went and found the lyrics. You said at the beginning something about willingness to change and recognize what we don't know. And I love this line from Simon and Garfunkel. I just put it in the chat from Kathy's song. He says, I've come to doubt. And so you see, I've come to doubt everything, all that I once held as true. I stand alone without beliefs. The only truth I know is you, right? And sometimes, I know it's a little sappy, but sometimes the human connection is even more powerful than our ideologies. Anyone else? Like, how do we know when we should change our views, right? And how can we connect with other people to help us to improve and broaden our perspective?
I see several students out there in the chat. I know I haven't greeted a couple of you because you arrived late. We're so glad you're here. Feel free to chime in. You can type into the chat. You can turn on your microphone and speak up, whatever you would like to do. We'd love to hear your voice in our conversation. So
I know for me, I've been looking at this a lot lately. I've been doing a lot of research and trying to figure out where we went wrong over the last 4 or 5 years as a society, at least here in America. I know it's going on in other places as well, but here in the States is more my thought right now because it's where I am. There seems to be a real incongruency between the pathos and the logos. We're seeing a lot of Philia Nakia, not enough Philia Sophia. There's no interchange of ideas anymore. Everybody's kind of rooted into their own sides, and I think a lot of it's based on media, social media, and the problems that they purport, because everybody's got a station they listen to, Everybody's got a root cause for their belief system, and they're so completely incongruent at this point that it's almost unbearable to watch from an
Mhm.
independent perspective. Um, and I have my own views, and I try to keep my biases out of that, but it's very daunting to think the way things are going right now, how much more they can spin out of control if we're not careful. And I'd really like to see a lot of people working on this, because I see people internationally working on it all the time, and I don't really see any American scholars coming on the internet and talking about, this incongruency that we're seeing, especially here where we've got like these, bands of marching people banging the drums, and it's like, what's going on here? Like, can't you see what's happening? And nobody seems to see it at all.
That reminds me of an old song too. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. But I love those points, Edward. I was saying, I love it's particularly, you talked about media. If you listen to media, I sometimes think like media is, of course, can be a big part of the problem, and I'll tune into different media sources sometimes just to hear what's going on. And I find some of it kind of disturbing, right? And so of course, we want to have media that's credible. It's not always easy to check credibility, especially if you are in it. Like if you believe what they're saying, how do you get out of your own web to test the credibility of the source that's telling you things you believe? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that people don't normally do that. They normally agree with things that say the things they agree with, right? And they say, well, that's credible because it's telling me things I agree with, so it must be good.
Chris, if I
It's
might
hard to get out of that. Go ahead, Clifford.
I was just going to speculate. This just came into my head, and I wish we had some psychologists here to refute this crazy idea I'm going to suggest. But I think there might even be something addictive about being in the presence of those that are reinforcing what we already believe. Because if you think about it, if they're reinforcing my beliefs, right, they're also reinforcing my identity, because my identity is wrapped up in my beliefs. So there's a sort of a addictive self-affirmation. How's that for an odd phrase? I think that comes about. I think there's something incredibly comfortable about being in a room, often a virtual room, of individuals who are all espousing exactly what we are. I also think we've left one related thought, and I'll stop talking. But I also think that we're in an age too, again, Edward, to tie back to what you shared, we're in an age where we don't have to, we can elect not to interact with those that we don't believe in. To go back to, as it were, the frontier days in America, where you lived out whoever lived a half a mile from you, they were the person that were going to help you, if there was a problem. You couldn't afford to just kind of ignore them. You couldn't afford to disregard what they believe. So I think there's also this sense to which we have the convenience now of a culture where we can surround ourselves only with those that believe the way we are. And I think there's something I think we get something out of it psychologically that is potentially harmful.
Well said. There's actually an article here. Let me scroll down to it. I'm going to skip some slides here, but I have some slides here about politics and culting. Like politics are can be like cults, right? And especially when you start talking about echo chambers and when you think about media. And I was going to say another thing about media. One thing to think about is credibility, but I also think there should be, I don't know if this has been published or not a lot, but sort of emotional credibility or emotional intelligence of your media. If you're listening to media and the goal is to make you hate people on the other side or who disagree, I think there's a kind of emotional intelligence that should be checked on that too. We ought to listen. I'm not saying that all good media should be neutral. There are things that a good media can take sides on, but not have the goal of vilification, right? So if your media is making people hate each other, that's not a very good source either. So credibility should not be the only metric. And I was thinking about cults, right? Political beliefs can resemble cults in the sense of their immunity to revision, right? That poisoning the well against everything that disagrees with you. If you preemptively poison the well, that anything disagrees with you should be ignored. That is one of the defining traits of cult thinking. So politics can be that way too, and it's very hard to escape that kind of thinking. Someone mentioned the echo chamber. A colleague, a Utah philosopher named T. Nguyen, very smart guy. He published this paper, How to Escape an Echo Chamber. Subtitle, first, you don't hear others' views, then you can't trust them. Your personal information network entraps you just like a cult. He has this whole article about how to escape from cult thinking and from echo chambers, and it's very difficult. I want to hear some people's thoughts. Michael, I saw you. I know you didn't raise your hand, but I'm going to just see. I noticed you unmuted your camera. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'm enjoying this talk. Thank you for the invite and for setting it up. I apologize for delaying Bill Davis's presence because we were going back and forth hot and heavy about some deep thoughts, and my cell phone, I'm up in the loft, so it takes a little bit of time to transfer between different routers. So I lose Bill every time he calls, or every time I call him. I call him about 4 or 5 times. So that was my bad. Sorry about that. But no, it's a great talk. I think that I don't want to open the political wormhole. So I'm just gonna say I'm just enjoying you flowing with it. Thanks.
Yeah, hey, and I'm going to jump in there, Chris, and just say one thing. These are just wisdom lessons we've all learned from, growing up. You got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything, right? And what's your value system? Do you know your core values? I've always grounded myself on, fairness, consistency, honesty, ethics, system, code of conduct, moral duties, legal obligations, etc. But you try to be fair, you try to be honest. And I think the one thing that was eye-opening for me when I went back to school as an adult learner, and it was a hard class. They put me in a logic class as I reconnected with my education. And now I didn't take every piece of that logic. I don't remember everything, but what I remember is the structure. Premise, conclusion. Is it a valid argument? Is it an invalid argument? Is it sound reasoning? When you attack an argument, you either attack the conclusion that doesn't follow the premises, or is there a weak premise that leads to a conclusion? So that's kind of where you start. So when I look at media, I just kind of consider the source, and I kind of look at my own system. I try to keep an open mind. I try to understand the needs, wants, the different behaviors, but and I just try not to judge. But then if I look at it, more broadly, now I'll have some different preferences and stuff like that. But I'm careful, what you say or how you say, because somebody might interpret it differently. But when you get in situations like this, like what Hector, or go back to Hector, what he shared earlier, I mean, that's worth its weight in gold, because all of a sudden he opens up this and it stimulates me and I come out with something else, and we're seeing it broader. We're seeing, higher sense of purpose. We're seeing keep an open mind. We're seeing, find that common ground with people, but you got to be committed to finding that common ground, and sometimes it takes time to get there. So hope that helps.
I love that, Bill. And it to me, it reaffirms something you said earlier about, the human connection and being there for people. And that's kind of why I shared that Simon and Garfunkel quote too. It's like, sometimes the human is the point and the ideology is backseat. Although sometimes the ideology is the point if we're talking about dealing with something like climate change. We gotta be there in both ways, right? I'm going to share another little thing as we get closer to the end of time here. Some lessons from the research I just kind of summarized from articles I read. Wood says, and he's one of the, Porter and Wood wrote that article, showing how people change their views. Don't place facts on too high a pedestal. It's only one component of the way the average people come to hold political preferences. For instance, we don't see any differences on policy preferences among the corrected and uncorrected groups. So even though people did change their beliefs about certain statements, it didn't change their overall. So don't overdo it on facts. Sudakow says, in that research, psychologists showed that logic worked only if people had a high involvement or were motivated to deliberate on the issue. In normal language, it means that it impacted them directly. Interesting. Got a couple more slides and we'll have more conversation. Harvard Business Review, Lisa Lai, she talked about focusing on emotional connections when you're trying to get someone to be interested in hearing your arguments. The emotion needs to be there. but then use logic if you're trying to change the direction. You don't change their overall views, but you change the direction it goes with logic. It reminds me of David Hume, a philosopher, who said that reason is a slave of the passions. In other words, we know what we want. Logic helps us to achieve it, but what we originally want comes from a deeper place. Logic just helps us to know what to do to get there. So the deeper mission comes from passion, Hume says. It kind of, I'm not saying that's what Lisa Lai believes. I'm saying that some of the stuff there kind of relates to that. You know, you can help to guide the decision making, but the overall goals come from a deeper place. Stafford, this is the last slide. The results show that when people have a low involvement in an argument, neither strong or weak arguments were persuasive. People's minds were made up and no argument shifted them. That's when they had a low involvement. But in a high involvement condition, both the strong and weak arguments had a significant effect. Another result that comes from analyzing transcripts of these types of experiments is that people are only persuaded when they can be shown that the answer they are currently advocating is wrong. Recently, a team led by Joseph Paxton of Harvard showed that in the domain of moral arguments, strong arguments were only persuasive if people were given some deliberation time before being forced to answer. Like crimes, it seems, requiring both motive and opportunity. If both are there, even in crude psychology experiments, we can show that strong arguments persuade. So it seems that despite all the biases we're subject to, we are sensitive to reason. We discriminate better arguments from worse ones. We often recognize the truth when it can be demonstrated, and adjust the strength of our beliefs when we discover we can't justify them as fully as we thought. Other work has shown that the skill of recognizing and developing arguments can be taught. And there's another source there. So I guess what I want to say in relation to that is a lot of you said these points already. I heard you guys saying, wow, I haven't even gotten to the last slide. And I heard you talking about people talking about having time to deliberate being important and the personal connections and all these things. You all already were there. But I do want to say another thing, an idea that maybe is hopeful, that there's this mug about critical thinking, a coffee mug that I just saw recently at our conference. It said, what do you think? And then I had the what scratched out and it said how. So it was corrected to say, how do you think? And so I think sometimes rather than sitting there and find someone who disagrees with you and try to talk them out of it, sometimes it's better just to start before that, at the note of before the tree branched off. And let's talk about the ideas, right? Let's talk about thinking itself. Let's talk about the skill of recognizing good versus bad arguments. In other words, let's learn logic and let's learn critical thinking together. And let's learn the value of scholarly research. So I sometimes think critical thinking is the way to like get at the root of the tree instead of just waiting for the branches to fight against each other.
Yeah, and Chris, I think that mug came from the old days, from the critical thinking workshop that Liz did, you know, we were here. But the thing I remember is Stephen Brookfield has burned in my mind along as well as your definition here. But yeah, you know, examine your assumptions with a healthy dose of skepticism, because they could be true or they could be false, but at least you'll proceed now with more informed action. You know, so you're right. We're thinking about our thinking, and because it's easy to rush to judgment.
Yeah. I love that. Any more thoughts, especially from the students that are here? Love to hear your ideas and thoughts about all this.
I'll share.
Please.
So I was thinking back to the social media point. I think that social media in general, as technology, sometimes is a barrier to establishing that personal connection. So although we would like to find a common ground and establish that connection, hiding behind a keyboard, hiding behind your computer, not, turning on our webcams like myself in this moment. But I think that's also another challenge that we face when we try to find a common ground.
Yeah, social media can be more alienating than, what's the opposite of alienating? Connecting, whatever. It can actually make things worse. I've actually heard from a person who's into a cause that I'm into. He says that social media has had a net negative, because it's like you post something, but then people just backfire against it in the social media context a lot of times.
Well, and the one thing I'll just leave you with too is, tone and sound is so important. How you write the words, how you say it, tact, where you say it, how you say it, who you say it to, because a lot of times, you can see situations where your intent might be right, but you started out wrong. And because you started out wrong, you put somebody on defensive, and now all of a sudden they're on the defensive, and you can't have critical thought. I mean, it's because somebody runs, it is what it is.
And we can't, and build a riff off of that. I think about a culture in which everything is fast paced and urgent. A culture of Twitter. Twitter is great for a snarky remark. It's not very effective for gentle persuasion. And yet these are the kinds of, and even Facebook, where most people don't post too much. No one will read a long post. So we only have enough to say enough to reach those that already think like we do. We're not taking the time to have these kind of meaningful dialogues that enable us to engage with the other, to see ourselves in the other, and to be open and human-hearted and receptive to each other. Instead, when we do try to persuade, it's because we've set out to persuade. I need to convince you of this. I think of the ultimate irony is two groups of people with opposite viewpoints demonstrating on a square, banging drums and shouting at each other. It's exactly the opposite, as we realize today, of anything that's going to convince anybody, and they're doing it. So it seems to me that we have a lot of challenges to overcome as a society to bring us back to a space where we start having conversations like this one today. Because I think that is where, and we find in having those conversations how incredibly enriching they are and how much more joy they bring us into our lives.
Well, they bring a lot of joy. We get to meet people, we get to engage. We're a little better when we leave it. And I thank Chris, for your vision and because I remember when you were going to first start in some of these sessions and so forth. And but it does mean so much. And I know that I've come here and I always walk away a little better. So thank you. And in one point, I want to just leave 4 quadrants when you negotiate. Remember, trust condition is unilateral negotiation. Trust condition, you compete, or you're smooth. You might, you get your goals to work with people, or you compete or you're passive. As long as you're working to try to build that trust and move in and try to find that common ground, things can work out. But sometimes they're not easy to get there, Clifford, like you said.
Well, we are out of time, but I'm just going to wrap up with this thought.
I'm going to post, if I can interrupt very quickly, Chris. If anyone is here from the honors program interested in receiving PLA credit, if you're a member of the honors program, you probably know what that is. If not, I can answer it and explain it. But if you want to fill out to receive PLA credit for the hour that you've spent with us today, I provided the link in the chat. Please use that link to access the form that you'll need to complete for that purpose. So, and thank you all. And Chris, let me turn it over to you. Sorry.
Sure. I was just going to close by this thought that I did not prepare. It's not on the PowerPoint. I hadn't formulated it because it just came to me because of everything that you all said, and including Hector's example at the beginning. That we talk a lot about critical thinking. What about critical emotions? Critical emoting? What we talk about our rational or logical skills. What about our emotional thinking and our emotional connection to humans that you were saying, Hector, with your example of your how sometimes the ideology is less important than your love for that human. And I think that when we do critical thinking, we need to put equal emphasis on how we on our emotional connections as well, and our priority to humans that we're in relationship with. So thank you.
Chris and Charles, thank you so much. This has been a most enriching hour. Thank you to all of you who came today and are supporting the honors program here at UAGC. And I'm just so excited and delighted. This is our last Honors Live event of 2021. We will be back in 2022. The first honors event is going to be an honors roundtable, the second half of January. And the next Honors Live Learning event will be in the first half of February. So I'll be looking for that bright and early in the new year. And happy holidays, absolutely, to everyone. And again, thank you all so much. you have any parting thoughts, feel free to share them. We'll stick around in case anybody has any additional questions. If you have questions about the honors program, I'd be delighted to answer them, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Happy holidays, everyone.